Welcome, everyone. European art at the Milwaukee Art Museum, and today it's my great pleasure to welcome you, along with William Brazil, my colleague at the Crocker Art Museum, to a webinar that deals with the all-important topic of funding curatorial projects within the museum setting. This topic, as well as the topics that sort of surround and touch it, is really an issue of great concern for many, many curators, because of course we all receive art historical training, but so few of us receive any kind of development or financial training. So this webinar, which is a very focused webinar, hopefully will begin to address some of those issues and really give you some concrete tools to take away from today's session. Before I introduce my colleague William, who will introduce our panelists today, there's one or two housekeeping details that we just want to cover. The structure of today's webinar, it's an hour and a half long. It's structured as an ongoing discussion, sort of steered by the questions that William and I will be asking our two panelists. So if you have questions that you would like to ask during the webinar, please ask those on a rolling basis. Please submit them on a rolling basis, and we will do our best to get to all of your questions as we go through the webinar today. But with that being said, it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague and co-organizer, William Brazil from the Crocker Art Museum.
Yes, I am the curator for European art at the Crocker Art Museum, and it's my great pleasure to welcome everyone here, and especially to welcome Joy Hireman, who is Deputy Director for Museum Advancement at the Walters Art Museum, and Linda Hartigan, the James B. and Mary Lou Hawks Chief Curator at the Peabody Essex Museum. So, the first question that we'd like to address is sort of an introduction of yourselves. For each of you, and let's begin with Linda, what is your current role within your institution? And then what role in fundraising for curatorial projects have you had? And then, if you can address this at the end, what role in fundraising for the museum in general?
Okay, so I'm Chief Curator at the Peabody Essex Museum, which means I work with our team of 10 curators in different global art arenas. I am part of the museum senior management team, and I also oversee publishing, collections, management, and exhibition design as part of my portfolio at the museum. In terms of fundraising specifically for curatorial projects, I'm involved in all of the identification of potential funding sources for exhibitions and publications, working closely with our development team, and do everything from helping to write grants to review the grants before they're sent out, meeting with individual donors and representatives of corporations who might be interested in funding the curatorial projects. And then generally for the museum, because we are, surprise, surprise, in the middle of a major endowment campaign, I work very closely with the director and our head of development to fundraise as well as to fundraise based on helping to develop strategies and actually meeting with people, making asks, being clear about who's going to be managing the various relationships.
Thanks very much. Yes, and then for Joy.
Oh yes, I'm Deputy Director for Museum Advancement here at the Walters, where I have been in this role, been in this side of the museum for 23 years. In terms of working on curatorial projects, I oversee the whole grants program, all of the exhibition and project support, as well as fundraising for annual giving that provides the unrestricted operating dollars that we rely on here as about a third of our operating budget. We are also just finishing up an endowment campaign, which is one that I have staffed, and I work with all of the board committees that are involved in fundraising, as well as with the lead volunteers, and manage a portfolio of donors myself in the foundation world, as well as individuals. And one of the main focuses really of my job is the strategy behind major projects. So really figuring out what the grant strategy will be, what kind of individual corporate support, foundation support will be involved, and making sure that we are communicating in a very clear way with donors to ensure that the museum doesn't catch itself up in its own feet. I also oversee the marketing communications for the museum, as well as visitor services. So the institutional messaging is a big part of what I spend my time on, and being clear about the movement that we are trying to move to engage people in, from awareness of the museum to engagement in programs to affiliation, and ultimately we hope to loyalty, is really the pyramid of engagement that I think about every single day.
Thank you both for that. And I would like to ask next, sort of, and Joy, I want to start with you. What do you see as some of the most important connections that a curator can make within the institution, within the museum, to facilitate fundraising for curatorial projects? And you can also speak to external relationships as well, but particularly want to speak to internal ones.
Definitely. And I think I even would want to shift some of the language of the question a bit, because I think that the most successful projects that I see happening at the museum are the curatorial, education, conservation, external affairs, are the ones in which an attitude of museum first has been adopted, so that fundraising in a really well-aligned organization happens for institutional priorities. So ensuring that your project as a curator has worked its way through the process that your organization has developed to set priorities is probably the most important initial step, and one that takes a lot of time. It's one that I'm sure we all know has some very specific aspects to it that are factual, but it also has, I think, an equally important relationship aspect, and that has to do with knowing and really embracing and being a part of a team of people that are going to make your project happen. The development office is one key area, certainly, and developing those relationships is exceedingly important. People take on fundraising in museums because, not really, I would say, because they're interested in money, but because they're interested in the projects and in the collections and in the mission of the organization. They come to it with very different tools, and they are set very specific challenges and goals, but your project, if it is a priority of the director, of a priority of the plans of the museum, will get its due if you've incorporated that into your thinking.
Okay. And Linda, if you would please, the same question.
I really want to heartily endorse what Joy has just said, because I think being able to demonstrate how a project is going to help advance the museum generally is absolutely critical to gaining support. And then, when you back up from that, then it's about how well do you understand the mission of the organization? Hopefully the curators have been more involved in the evolution and framing of the mission of the institution, either in concert with the director or some members of the board. But really having that demonstrable understanding and being able then to make the case, I think being verbally articulate as well as in writing, and in a concise way is extraordinarily helpful in terms of demonstrating that kind of connection. I would also say that I personally have found it very helpful to have as good an awareness, and I'm talking about this even before being a chief curator at an institution, being, I think, as well educated as one could be about the budgeting process and how an organization really goes about looking at what its direct and its indirect costs are. I have found, frankly, that if you ask someone with that kind of accounting and budgeting experience to actually explain something to you about how it is they work and how they think and how that relates to the institution getting done what it needs to get done, that is also a way to begin to build a different kind of approach to, like, who's on the team of trying to figure out what is the range of costs that could be supported for a project, why that would be helpful to the institution, that sort of thing. I've also found development staff really eager to talk about how it is that they do their work and to have that direct line of communication about, how is it that a curator could coach someone in development in terms of understanding certain aspects of what they're interested in, and then the two-way street of having a development staff person being open to coaching a curator in terms of, here's how you might shape that case better, or here's how we start to think about when is it that you actually ask for money, and here's how you could think about visiting with someone, making the case in person, writing the better statement. So to me, it's that kind of give and take and how you share expertise across parts of what is an entity that's really critical for fundraising success.
Great, thank you.
I think of it as a team sport.
Absolutely. As opposed to a competition.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, the next question actually sort of follows up with some things that Linda was saying. So if you'd like to expand on sort of the last part, the question is worded this way. Curators are often shy about asking for money and generally receive little training for it. And how does one know when it's appropriate to do so? And how do you sort of test the waters, so to speak, if you're dealing with, for example, gaining support for projects within the institution, or with external donor prospects, or with grant-making agencies? So it's sort of a three-part question in that way.
That's lots of things to cover there. Let's start internally. We don't really all have that many water coolers to gather around anymore in our environment, but I have found that sitting down and chatting with people, either curatorial colleagues as well as people in development, about like even the nascent idea, to see if there's an inkling of sticky power in relation to what that project might mean for the institution, is genuinely helpful. I think once you get to the point internally of moving through the channels, and every organization is different. For example, let's just take exhibitions in terms of who reviews an idea and agrees to place it on a schedule. If you're in a museum where the director is the principal decision maker about, yes, you're going to do this exhibition, then really developing the relationship with that individual about how to begin to identify the resources needed and how to go about doing that is critical. If you are in an institution where you have an exhibition review committee, then I think it's about figuring out how to make a very effective presentation, and then once you get the approval, really working hand in hand with development staff to identify what is the likely path of support? Is it more likely to be something for corporations or for foundations, or is this really about focusing on individuals? And then I think some of this is the intangible, and Joy, maybe you'll agree with this in terms of what the character of the institution is and where it sits in the community, because you have to look at the economic and financial surround of your community, however you define that, or of the business world and the art professional world at large, because I'm thinking back to like 2008 even, and what challenges that represented. I think then, understanding that people also expect to be asked to support something if they are already involved in the museum is important. So shyness is not a characteristic that goes hand in hand with asking. So figuring out, where are you in the development of your personal relationship with someone, because people give to people, and knowing when you actually have a timeline against which you have to raise money are all factors that come into play, whether it's about talking to individuals or foundations, like knowing what a foundation's lineup of when they review proposals, for example, is critical. Because if you're out of step with that, then you don't exactly increase your chances for getting the money. I actually consider myself always being in development mode in terms of whoever it is that I'm in contact with, because you just never know where that good moment of personal connection and conversation could lead to somewhere down the line. So I think just really understanding that that's always in the background is also important.
I think what I would add to that is the whole, one of the things that has helped me, being a relatively introverted person myself, and I think shyness is something that we all have to overcome over time. When people have asked me, though, how is it that you can ask for money? I think just by making a little switch in your brain about you're not, just being aware that you're not asking for yourself. You're asking for the museum, and this is where this, in a way, it sort of reinforces what I said initially, that when you know that your project has gone through this process and that actually is a museum priority, you're asking for something that is institutionally supported, and you have all of that backing behind you. So you shouldn't feel like you're dangling out on a limb. You should never feel like you're dangling out on a limb when you're raising money. You need to be prepared. You need to have research behind you, and just, I think, for all of you who are kind of getting to know organizations, development staff are most of all focused on strategy and putting the right people in the right place and crafting the theater of making an ask. We don't give all those parties just because we like parties. We know that we operate in the museum world with something that we call in the profession an open constituency, which is very different from the closed constituency that you would find in an alumni donor base. We have a connection with people that they can shed at any moment, so that the way that we develop relationships over time, the way that we are careful in our communication with them, the way that we steward those relationships is extremely important. Knowing what the plans are for particular donors, I think that's another thing that makes this nexus between development and curatorial so important. You may think, that this is the perfect person. We talked about it at a cocktail party. They took a great interest, and the development staff and the director may be moving them towards an endowment gift or a capital project. They may be thinking about a gallery that they need to have their name on, and your project needs to be put into that hopper and kind of figured out where it fits in. So just being really aware of all of the different initiatives that are going on in your museum is really, really important. in terms of testing the waters and being an external advocate, I think this is where I would just counsel not to test the waters until you have the go-ahead. I've seen a lot of things get derailed or created a lot of internal turmoil that was unnecessary before that go-ahead was offered. Working with development staff in stewarding the grant-making agencies, the federal agencies, foundations, all of that, you have a very particular and very, very important role to play as a curator. And knowing how best to say your lines and when they're going to be most likely to be heard. All of that is part of this theater that I think is really the fun of the fundraising process.
And if I could just add this, I think some of this is about the confidence that comes from daring to have a good idea, daring to advocate for it so that it's approved, so that from that goes on the energy and the passion and the daring to believe that it is fundable and that there are ways to create partnerships, because I think we can lose sight of that in point of fact, when you really believe in something and that's been endorsed by an organization, to Joy's point, that's an incredibly powerful platform from which to proceed as an individual, as part of a group effort.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Well, I have a related question, and sort of following on all of that, that all-important ask. What and Joy, I'm going to direct this to you first. What are the elements of a clear, concise proposal for support, and how is that proposal best delivered to different sorts of prospects, internal, external, that sort of thing?
Mm-hmm. I'm going to assume that the art historical background for any proposal that a curator at one of our museums puts forward is going to be strong and well researched. Then I would start looking for connections to the collection and why it's appropriate for this museum uniquely to be doing. I think differentiating your project in a very specific way is really, really important. I think I always look for an understanding of audience, of who, for whom this project is best crafted, and what will be required internally. I think a knowledge of the timeline, the team that's necessary, the resources that are necessarily internally, what Linda was talking about, the soft costs, the total budget, that's really important, and very compelling visuals. We operate in a visual world, and having some key images that get seared into our brains, internally and externally, to sort of will really help to move a project forward. And then again, sort of going back to something I said before, the right person presenting and the right person asking is really key. And that can be, I'm a very firm believer in peer-to-peer fundraising, so I like to involve board members and high-level volunteers as much as I can. Having the director who is comfortable and excited by the sport of fundraising is a great gift, and I guess I've kind of said it all, but having the right person make the ask is exceedingly important.
I would say that one of the things that we've become very aware of recently is a rising desire among funders to have the confidence that you are very clear about what the big idea is, what your goals are, what the outcomes are that you expect. I mean, a part of this also relates to the audience point that Joy brought up. But I think also demonstrating capacity for understanding what the project is also going to do for the funder is also critical. And that means you need to understand what the requirements are, what they actually are really interested in. Just as you have had to build the case internally about why the project is great and aligned with the institution, we have that same responsibility to carry that forward to the external funders, because I think sometimes you can sit and think, this corporation is perfect because this is the kind of product that they do, or that,
Right.
you know, whatever reason it may be. But in point of fact, understanding what they want to accomplish is very much part of, I think, what ultimately leads to the most successful fundraising, especially with corporations and foundations.
And I'll just follow up a little bit on that in terms of the whole notion of thinking about outcomes. We've found that that's where our education staff is the most helpful on the team. They are the ones who really have pushed us forward to think about outcomes, learning outcomes, expectations that then feed into the evaluation process that happens during the course of a project. And this is where I think a very important partnership really needs to be forged between curatorial and education staff. They think in this language in a way that I think all of us can learn from.
Couldn't agree more.
And we have one question here from one of our audience members that I'll just jump in and ask right now. And either one of you happy to, if you feel like you have a good source, this would be great. As a curator, I'm in charge of raising my own project funds, and I have the skills and experience required to write a good grant proposal, but don't have the time to find potential funders or to research the goals of foundations and other giving agencies to figure out if they line up with the goals of my projects. Is there a database, a website, or another source you can recommend?
Oh, certainly the resources of the Foundation Center are helpful. I always find, I find it very helpful to stay on top of funding that you see in other museums' projects. I pay a lot of attention in your community. Your community foundation itself can be a very helpful source. And I think the Foundation Center would be a great database to start. That's a subscription service that I think your museum would probably find is very well worth the expenditure.
And is the question being asked from the perspective of someone at a museum without a development function, in other words?
I'm assuming so. It's not clear,
Right.
but I'm assuming so.
Right.
Yeah, well, once in that, I mean, obviously there are resources that a development staff would have access to that wouldn't be relevant in this particular case. So I think I don't have anything to add to what Joyce suggested.
Right.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Good luck.
Okay. Well, as we continue, I wanted to have a question about the financial world. And in a changing financial world, lean periods can come at any time. How can one assess the situation regarding projects for the future when something like a stock market crash, 2008 is always on our minds, comes along, which can affect both endowment and donor giving? And also, are there specific examples that could illustrate decisions about what to pursue, what to put off at such a time? And let's begin.
Wow. All right, well, I'll give us a specific example related to the last part of that question. When everything happened in 2008 and 2009, the executive leadership team of the museum and the board leadership came together to say, all right, really, this may be an opportunity as opposed to a disaster for us to really think about and realign our strategies for success. And rather than, for example, cut back on the exhibition program, because that would have been a logical place to reduce expenses and the need to fundraise and that sort of thing, we made a commitment to really even increase and escalate the power and the quality and the incidence of the exhibition program, believing that that was going to be the best way to not just sustain the people who were loyal to the museum, but perhaps give them comfort and confidence in our ability to keep moving forward. And on the short term and on the long term, we found that people were much more inclined to invest with us because we made that kind of, if you will, riskier decision rather than perhaps a safer decision. Now, that does not mean that we didn't trim. I mean, we certainly trimmed in other areas, but we were always trying to adjust the machinery so that it was oriented toward success rather than, I need to be careful about how I say this, you can get so much into sort of drastic survival mode in those kinds of circumstances that you don't necessarily look for what is it that I can make most out of this situation, because quite frankly in the business world we all know that people profited from what happened in 2008. There were people who figured out where the business opportunities were in that. And so taking some hints from an entrepreneurial attitude in hard times, I think is something that's really worth looking hard at.
I'd riff on that a little bit just by saying that was a really challenging and very, very interesting time actually to be in this world, and we did some similar things here. Certainly trimmed, cut the staff in fact by about 10%. But certain projects we kept on board because, again, people want to be on a winning team, and they want to be involved with an organization that is not closing up shop, but is managing effectively, that is moving forward, that has a positive attitude even in the middle of really difficult times. And I would say that I think that too was something that we really were very careful about in our strategy, but also in our communications. In those times, I think there is a very important role for curators to play. We may be in a mode of raising money for, in fact, what we did was we did something called bridge funding, which was actually asking for support to make up for the diminution in endowment income that we were seeing in the operating budget. So we were very focused on that with most of our donors. What curators really helped us do, and conservators and educators, and I think even everyone on the staff, from the wonderful, friendly security officers and maintenance people, all the way to the director, are really working to keep people close and to give them a sense of how important what they do at every level is to keeping the museum going. We wanted to communicate that we were being thoughtful in applying our resources, that we were taking, that sacrifices were being made across the board, so that it really was from top to bottom, with more of it concentrated at the top, and that we did in fact cancel a very high-profile exhibition that really, I think, helped to crystallize that the situation that we were in with our leadership and with our key donors. It was something that no one wanted to do, but by making it quite public and clear that we had to do this in order to face the situation the way we needed to, I think we actually profited from that in a just in terms of people's understanding of the importance and the unusual nature of what we were facing. But we did a lot more close stewardship. We spent a lot of time with people and benefited, and also made some very interesting new investments in the whole technology side of things that allowed us to come out of the recession in a lot stronger position. So I think really being able to communicate and have this be understood across the board, that what we were trying to do was exactly the kind of entrepreneurial, more risk embracing and thoughtful management was helpful, I think, internally as well as with donors.
Great. In a related sort of topic, there are also times when the museum's focus is very goal-directed, like during a capital campaign, a building project, that sort of thing. And Joy, I'll turn to you. Are there comments you can share about how curators can really navigate those kinds of situations and ensure that that their sort of project is in line with that larger picture, as it were?
Well, I think this is where being very aware of institutional plans is helpful, and this is I think of Linda probably is in that key role in a museum of making it transparent and visible and understandable to curators who what the rest of the museum is up to and where and how their projects fit into the big picture. That sensitivity, I think, and again, I'm beginning to sound, I think, like a one-hit wonder here. that the whole notion of institutional priorities and what the museum is up to, and where your projects fit into those plans is the most important thing that you can know. And it's very much a key aspect of management and of senior leadership to figure out how to keep so many balls up in the air. And it is possible. You know, we all know that multitasking is possible to do, and that institutions do a lot of complicated things at the same time. And that's where communication is so, it is the most important thing. That if we are aware and communicating and clear, we can do a lot of extraordinary things. If that communication breaks down and people begin to feel like they don't fit into the picture, or they're sidelined, or all of those things that you probably heard at times, that's when the communication is not working, in my view. And I just would encourage everyone who's listening in to think about ways that communication can be helped, and how the kinds of questions that you can ask to get to some of these institutional issues that will be helpful to you to understand where you fit into the picture.
So to that, and again, this is about almost the scalability within institutions, but certainly one of the things that we try to do, because I don't want to say but the development staff and the curatorial staff have made a real commitment here to regularly communicate. And that's not just about passing in the hall or the fast email or what have you, but there is a rhythm that's evolved in terms of really creating direct partnerships. We've gone so far, for example, as based on how the development team is organized into sub-teams, different curators have a team member in development with whom they have the principal relationship. And so it becomes a two-way street of sharing information and communicating about changes in plans or priorities. It also helps to make clear who's the relationship manager, if you will. Sometimes it's the curator, sometimes it's someone in development, sometimes it's someone on the executive leadership team, but we try to be about as explicit about that sort of thing as we possibly can. And I think as questions come up about, all right, we're raising money for buildings, so does that mean I can't ask so-and-so for money towards a major acquisition? Joy's earlier point about knowing what's in store from an institutional viewpoint for a particular individual is absolutely critical. I mean, we've certainly come across people who will say things like, not interested in giving money to endowment, but I'm really interested in helping this area of the collection. As long as that's an agreed upon plan for that individual, then you can begin to have the right kinds of conversations with them, because it is also about that marriage between what someone wants to do, what they're interested in, and what it is that you have to offer. Right. Certainly we have found, and I think this is kind of true along the human ladder of development, oftentimes getting someone involved with helping with an acquisition can then mean that they might be interested in helping with an exhibition. Then they might grow into wanting to help with larger development initiatives and goals for the institution. It can also sometimes work the other way. The big donor who comes in and says, I really want to give you X amount of bucks for the building, if they have any kind of passion that you can hook into otherwise, then you can work them down through building the relationships into other activities at the museum, because in point of fact, after they give their money for the building, you don't want them to go away. So it's like, you know, having all these multiple contact points that are going to keep them connected.
Mm-hmm. Well, the next question is, I think part of the next question has already been addressed, but I think that it might be helpful to sort of have, you know, some specifics related to this. What are some of the ways that curators can ensure the best relationships with their colleagues in development, and also with outside prospects?
Do you want me to dive in, Linda? I think, first of all, be friendly to them.
Yeah.
Realize that they are working with different tools for the same ends. And that is a lot of it. I think as much as you can, get to know what their challenges are. You know, development staff, unlike in Curatorial, actually have very quantitative goals. And every July 1, if you're on that fiscal year, things go to zero. And I think being aware of the sort of the cycles of giving, you know, that you're going to know that towards the end of the fiscal year, there's a lot of pressure on to get things in the door. That every December, when you take off for your 2 weeks off over the holidays, the development office is staffed fully, and they are working day in and day out. Just be aware of those kinds of things. Follow advice. Know that people come to this work with very specific training and skills, and that they want, they know that you can play a very important role in this, and in working together is really how you're going to get to the finish line together. I really believe in asking people to lunch, a nice going to coffee. When you're going off with colleagues, think about sometime asking someone from another part of the museum. It sends a really important message that's really remembered if you've been friendly.
And the friendliness, I think, is also linked very clearly to the whole idea of respect. Just as a curator wants to be respected for the knowledge and the connections that each of us bring to the museum and to our audiences, respecting the kind of skills and talents that it requires to be a really successful person engaged in development is absolutely critical. And one of the ways I think is most effective to actually demonstrate that respect is to indicate a desire to learn from them. I brought up this whole idea of coaching earlier, to really sit down and just as you want to have them be knowledgeable about your projects, the more you know, not just about their challenges and their goals on an annual or long-term basis, but really, what are the fundamentals of development? How can you practice them, learn how to practice them as part of your curatorial practice, and in being a more effective partner, I think is also really critical. In terms of the external, it's a serious investment of time, and I would also say an investment of sincerity in terms of believing in what you're doing, believing in the institution, believing that it is possible to build effective human relationships that are not predicated solely on, as long as I take you out to dinner or see you X number of times, because there are people who have these theories about touch someone X number of times and then it's okay to ask them for money. I'm not so sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but really focusing on how you can build a good, personally balanced, professional relationship with someone, I think really lays very sound foundations for those people then having a confidence in you and when you come to make a case.
That's it.
Okay, so shifting gears slightly here, I would love to know what are some of the scenarios that curators can expect participation with individual donor prospects, particularly when that contact is initiated by another office in the museum, like a curatorial lunch or private tour that's offered in connection with a larger project. How can a curator know sort of whether this is an opportunity to develop a more personal relationship with that individual donor, or when it's time to hang back? How should a curator suss that out? And Joy, if you want to take that one.
Well, I think it's always that. It's always an opportunity to pursue and develop a personal relationship, but it's also not an open door. And that, I think, that's where we get back to this whole notion of teamwork and working together. That the scenarios that we use that are probably most effective are presentations with small groups, where there's a very carefully scripted role for everyone to play, and in maybe say a 2 or 3-on-1 or 3-on-2 ask for a specific project. One of the scenarios that I think is really important for everyone who does development to understand is that there's a very important moment that happens after the actual request has been made, and it has to be very carefully scripted who is going to make that request and when. I have actually seen things, long dinners go on, and in the parking lot, someone sort of saying, "Well, wait a minute, I meant to, that was not my script," but there is a very sort of wonderful moment where it takes a lot of self-discipline after the ask is made to be absolutely quiet. And that time can actually go on for minutes, and the horror of the vacuum will come into your mind, and you will want to jump in, and you will want to double down, you will want to keep the conversation going, but it is absolutely a rule of this particular form of theater that the next line is the donors. Mm-hmm. And I think just even being aware of that little trick of the trade, I think will help anyone in this this high stakes game. And it's kind of a fun thing to prepare for, and then to watch and live through, and you can see, and you will see when you're in that situation why it's so crucial.
And then, if you want to dial back even before the formal ask, one of the things that I think is actually very beneficial, and this presupposes that you have some kind of reason to understand that you have a good working relationship with someone that you are likely to want to ask money of, is to actually seek their advice, to to use them as a sounding board. Sometimes you can quickly suss out from that, well, actually, maybe not so much. I'm not going to go down this road with this person later.
Mm-hmm.
Or, yes, there actually is that window door opening, but I'm not going to ask now. I'm going to find out what it is that's going to make me more successful ultimately when I do get to the asking point. I think the scenario that I really dislike the most, and it's hard to know sometimes when that's going to happen, is the person who understands that you're coming to ask, and they've decided to be preemptive. And before you can even start down the road of the pitch, you know, they want to tell you immediately, oh, I know you're here to ask me for money, and I'm prepared to give you X amount. And inevitably, that X amount is not anywhere near what you would like to see happen. And so what I have learned to do somewhat painfully, frankly, is to say, oh, actually, I wasn't coming here to ask you for money. I'm here to kind of just talk through the project. I'm trying to get some feedback. Let's not go there yet. I mean, you want to strangle the person, but it's just trying to, get yourself back more into the driver's seat, because the more you let that happen, the more that particular type of individual understands that you will settle. So part of it is also just trying to suss out, when is that likely to happen? And that's when talking to colleagues about people's patterns, whether that's about, someone else outside of your field having been involved with this person, the research on the individual's philanthropy patterns, your director's experience with the person really helps to prepare you for that sort of thing. I mean, sometimes you do have to walk out with that preemptive check, but other times it's better to try and turn the table on them.
There's some other kind of wonderful aspects about development that seem to always come true, and that one thing that I always talk about is the pyramid. The pyramid always prevails, and one of the things that you'll find with sophisticated development people is that they understand who needs to be asked first, and then what the domino effect is from that first ask, because you really have to set the bar high if you have a major goal. And people are kind of remarkable. You probably wonder why it is that development always publishes lists. Well, lists kind of set it all out there, and people really want to know. They have their own internal sense of where they fit in the scheme of things. And on the one hand, they want to put themselves forward. On the other, they don't want to appear to be pushing past leadership. And that's kind of an odd aspect of the psychology of the donor that I've always found very interesting. That once that initial, the major lead gift is in very often, no one will go beyond it, because they would feel that would be somehow poor manners, poor comportment to put themselves forward like that. So being able to play that and understand that helps with understanding the sequencing that can be so important in getting the momentum going on a big project.
Well, I suppose one of the values of those lists, like in the annual reports where people are shown in what range of money they've given, there is a certain kind of psyche that's going to respond to that and say, I may need to up my game because I want to be perceived in this realm.
Yes.
And that's not something you can help people with at all, but it is a tool that development uses, for sure.
Well, so much of what development really does is provide frameworks for people to find their place. And that's true with the volunteer structures that we put in place, as well as with donor structures. And I have to say, I've had phone calls from people after our published list comes out, telling me who is at the wrong level and where they should actually be. And that's just part of the game, too.
You go talk to them and help us get them to that level.
Exactly. Will you let us sign that letter, please?
Yeah.
Exactly.
Well,
Sorry, William, go ahead.
I was about to say, why don't we take some of the questions that have come in over from the participants in the webinar. And I'm dealing with a teeny tiny box that I can read here, so please forgive me if it's a little disjointed. In any case, one of the questions is, at some point in the discussion, would you comment on the process of working with an outside firm on an endowment campaign versus handling the campaign internally? And of course, this question would tie in with the question of funding curatorial projects as an endowment campaign is going on.
Well, Joy, you're probably in a better position to answer this. I mean, it depends on what your definition of the outside firm is. I mean, we've worked with outside strategic planning firms to help us really open up our own thinking, so it's not just so internalized, and it's a way of testing, you know, what it is that you want to stretch your campaign to and how you keep it aligned internally. But we've not actually worked with, and I've had no personal experience working with an outside consultant who comes in and says, you know, here's what you need to do. So Joy, you may have more experience in that direction.
I've had some very, very productive experience with that, as well as made the decision in some instances of running campaigns internally. What I find with outside firms is that there is this wonderful notion that you really can't be a prophet in your own land, and outside consultants can often help to crystallize the case for something in a way that can be heard in a very different way. It almost speaks, Linda, to your example of the strategic planning consultants, that getting that outside perspective, often bringing very fruitful information from the field, that can be a really wonderful thing. It still requires enormous internal coordination, because especially if you have a firm that is committed just to a particular campaign, a particular goal, how you parcel out and continue to support the operations of the museum, support the projects that are part of the operating budget from year to year, that needs to be worked out and needs to be thoughtfully planned in order to make sure that you haven't sort of taken all of your best donors and put them into the endowment or campaign fold. The other thing that we've also had tremendous success with is really thinking about tiered requests, so that when we talk to a person who's close in about an endowment campaign, a capital campaign, at the same time we're also emphasizing how important their operating gift is every year, so that they don't feel like they're being nickeled and dimed, they're not getting multiple requests from us, and the people who are making the major requests are well aware of how generous they are in other areas of the museum. So a lot of that has to do with just being very, very well prepared as a solicitor, and also making sure that you are not forgetting about how important it is to turn the lights on every day and make sure that everyone gets a paycheck every 2 weeks.
Well, I suppose that also goes to the point of how you prevent donor burnout. I mean, there are people who are going to come to the end of their intention to share resources, but too many asks, too many of the wrong kinds of asks, ill-timed asks, let alone just always giving, for some people can become a wonderful habit, but otherwise people do burn out in terms of, I've given you a lot already, why do I need to keep giving? And then you need to be prepared with a really good answer.
And this is also part of where that bigger strategic aspect comes in, of always making sure that your development efforts, your audience development efforts, your donor acquisition efforts are visible and even if they have slowed down and are not as productive as they may have been in times of, the Blockbuster exhibition when memberships were double what they are now, that you still are showing the people who really are investors in your organization that you are working all of the angles. Right? You're being judicious about your use of resources, but you're not relying on them to bail you out at every turn. That you've got new donors, that you're finding people outside of your community, or that fit a different profile from what your normal donor pool has been. That communicating that and making that clear to your core is also really, really important, so that they feel like that you're not just going to come back to them over and over and over again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so part of what you're talking about is just really strategic alignment among all of those parts, and I think that it's probably safe to say that if you keep hitting the need button as opposed to the significance button, that's a fast way to wear out your welcome.
Right. I actually was talking to a staff member the other day, and we were talking about a significant cut that had been expected to our state funding this year. It turned out not to be an issue, but I said that you can really play that card maybe once every couple of years. You don't want to be Chicken Little, but there are moments when some financial or physical or weather disaster can actually serve your purposes of raising funds and raising the profile of the museum. So you need to be aware of those kinds of things, but be very, very careful about using them.
Mm-hmm. Well, we have an additional question from one of our audience members that speaks to, I guess, the question of a very specific need in this case. What are the best approaches for securing funding for a new staff member as opposed to a specific project? And either one of you can have a sense of this.
Well, I hate to say it, but I suppose it actually depends on what the nature of that staff position is. Mm-hmm. And maybe I'd approach it in terms of thinking about making the case of what that area of expertise or activity, as opposed, the moment you personalize it in terms of I need to hire this person, as opposed to this is expertise that's going to expand our capacity to do something, that would be probably more the direction I would think about going, because it had better not be like a short-term need. I think people really want to know that something's going to add a longer-term kind of benefit.
That makes a lot of sense.
It's easier to make the case. I think it's easier if you're talking about how do we endow a curator's position. That's one kind of case that a certain kind of donor affiliated with the museum is going to be able to understand. But I think, as museums have looked at how to expand their development staff, how to expand their marketing staff, how to expand their digital resources, really explaining what that expertise is going to bring to the table through staff enlargement is important, because also when donors are also often business people, they are on their end of the game used to having inevitably people coming in and say, I can just do more if I had more staff, and that's not necessarily a case that's going to be successfully heard. It's really about the value added of reaching a particular goal.
Yeah, and I have to say that the dreaded term ROI comes up quite a bit. Return on investment. What will this person bring to the organization that isn't here now, and how does it balance out against the resources that it will take to bring them on?
Mm-hmm. Because it is a long-term investment.
And often people think, they think only in terms of salary, but there are many, many other aspects of what a person costs in terms of their benefits, their their technology support, all of the overhead that really we're not very good at calculating in museums, I think.
Well, I'm also then going to make an equation that some people might be uncomfortable with as curators, but I would say that we actually look at even the addition of objects to the collection in somewhat the same way, because there are long-term costs associated with acquiring objects for the collection. So we've actually moved, if we understand that someone has the capacity to do so, whether it's a single object or whether, especially if it's a larger collection, we have actually moved to the so great you want to give this to us. Here's how you could also be helpful to us in terms of beginning to build an understanding that it's important to support the conservation, the photography, the hidden costs of storage and that sort of thing. I mean, we took in a very large and important collection of fashion recently, and we had conversations with the woman donating the collection to say, you know, in order to really advance our capacity to do well by the material, here's how you could also be helpful. Now, she had the means, and she heard that case. So, you know, there was a certain amount of money that came along with the idea of care for the collection. So it's another example of long-term costs.
The next question, actually, I think applies both to curators and to development professionals. How would you advise a curator or development professional to keep a project moving forward during a time of institutional transition, that is, a leadership change or a structural reorganization?
One of the great challenges.
It is, definitely. Stick to your knitting. But I think, you know, again, that this is where that whole notion of institutional priority and team can really, really help you. I mean, when a new director comes on, if they find projects that are sort of floating out with single operators versus things that are kind of embedded deeply in the staff that he or she determines is really where the center of gravity is in the museum, which one do you think is more likely to stay moving forward? I think that's, you know, that's never an assured fact. I mean, we all know that, having just gone through this myself, that when a new director comes on, you really have no idea what their priorities are going to be, and it is a process of getting to know someone just the way you would get to know a donor. And at the same time, your project is much more likely to stay on track if it has other advocates other than yourself.
And you know, it's a little bit about reading the tea leaves, but your point about getting to know the new players and the changing landscape associated with a structural reorganization, although obviously some of that gets held close to chest until it's actually announced. But I think being really pointedly flexible about being an advocate, just because something's been approved in certain instances just doesn't mean that your advocacy is over. So constantly trying to figure out what the next best point of connection is, looking forward and anticipating rather than assuming that somehow it's all just going to happen is really important. So that proactive element without being obnoxious about it is important.
And there is a question here specifically for you, Linda, but I think it's something that I think both of you could probably address. But the question is specifically, Linda, can you please give examples of how you work with a curator through the funding process?
Okay. So when we launch exhibition ideas here, and this may be a slightly longer answer than it should be, but we hold ideations with the curators where they simply throw out an idea, and it's purely on the idea basis. So if the idea, from my perspective, has sticky power, Then we go on to develop exhibition proposals. But part of that process that we now do is really connecting the curator with development staff to talk about what the development potential is and in what quarters, in order for the curator to bring that to the table, just as we ask a curator to intersect with the education staff to understand the types of audiences or the diversity of audiences that a project is likely to attract. A curator also talks to our marketing person in advance, and so when that exhibition proposal comes to the exhibition review team, they have demonstrated a connectivity with different parts of the institutional mandate. And so part of my job, frankly, is to make sure that that's happening, to have discussions with the curators in order to hold that into a successful exhibition proposal. Inevitably, particularly as we go forward to foundations and corporations and individuals, it will either be the curator and a development person going out together. There might be a trio of us going out together, or it may just be me and the curator going out. But I also do a lot of coaching as well as in concert with the development staff in terms of how we can think through the strategies and the steps and who does what. So I'm probably much more hands-on with the curators in terms of helping them to understand that they have a supportive base from which to work, not just within the curatorial realm through me, but because I'm also a major partner with our development staff, and that the development head and I expect that that partnership is going to filter throughout the entire curatorial staff.
Do you find, Linda, that as this process goes along, as these conversations are happening, that projects get refined, or do ideas change and morph? What's your experience with that? I'm always interested in that.
Our goal is to make a project as strong as it possibly can be conceptually, as well as in terms of its impact. And we can put under the umbrella of impact its capacity to help us raise money for the project, as well as to draw support to the museum. So we have overall at the museum a very strongly team-oriented approach, so that even as an exhibition is approved, there's a team put in place in order to move that project forward. And so whether it's through the interpretation discussion, the fundraising discussion, there is inevitably change that occurs. Part of what I just watch for, frankly, is when discussion and the desire for change doesn't turn into a taffy pull, as
Right.
I call it, because you can also tear something apart by constantly questioning it. So it's what's the timing of the constructive criticism, and what is the timing of we're done, we're really happy with this idea, and here's the basis from which we're going to raise the money and the basis from which we're going to interpret and design. So it's, you know, it's like the up periscope routine in my.
Right, I think it's very wise. I commend you.
Well, I enjoy it. I mean, we're all, you know, otherwise things are going to fail, and I don't do failure stuff.
Let's take, looking at the time, it seems that we should take maybe one more question and then wrap it up. So this is a question that's come in having to do with how to ensure the best relationship with the development officers when you're dealing with initiatives to fundraisers or support grant writing for one's exhibitions. If their attention, I can imagine that it might be elsewhere, how to refocus, that kind of thing.
I actually did a little research on this question yesterday in talking to one of our grant writers, and she said, turn things in on time. You know, one of the things that we've been really careful about, and I think have gotten quite refined here, is the timeline of putting together, say, a complicated National Endowment for the Humanities proposal. You know what those take. They're books in the end. And just adhering to a schedule of outcomes and of different products that are necessary to pull something together will give you, and holding other people accountable just the way you hold yourself. I think that's what a team really needs to do. And it's when people get stopped dead in their tracks because they're waiting for something that you can often derail not just the project but some of the relationship that you've been so careful to cultivate. So that's my contribution direct from the source.
Earlier in the conversation, you alluded to the value of also getting input from the education or perhaps interpretation staff. I think the language of grant writing is specialized, just as curatorial writing can be. But really, understanding the language pool or direction from which you are most effectively going to present the case within the format of a grant-making organization. I mean, I think of the NEH. I mean, you can look at it and say, but I think the ideas need to be over here. But in point of fact, their format drives you in a different direction. So really getting input in terms of the clarity, leaving the time actually for someone who may not be as deep into something as you and the grant writer are to actually review it, to see if it's clear, if it's making a cogent case. Have you been repetitive? What have you left out? I mean, those are the kinds of things that we try to leave time for as we prepare grants here.
Absolutely.
Great. So go ahead, William. Sorry. Oh, so it looks like we're sort of, maybe we have time for sort of one final point of discussion. I guess we can either ask a final question or yeah, I think why don't we ask this, one of the sort of questions we had on our list of things to consider. When the relationship with an outside donor is something that was initially initiated by a curator, as might be the case with a donor who's also a collector, that sort of thing. Do you have advice for keeping development in the loop, that sort of thing, just sort of making sure that everyone's on the same page, but also ensuring that that patron feels like that kind of specialness of the relationship is still kept intact?
I think, my goodness, I think the whole idea of, again, of open communication is really important, and recognizing that keeping notes on the record of your contact and making sure that there is a paper trail that the next curator that follows you might be able to pick up with that donor if you should leave your museum. That background information that you learn from spending time with that person, what their real hot buttons are, what their collecting interests are, how old their children are, all those kinds of things are relevant information that the institution needs, not just you or not just the development office, and you can really play a very important role in that. I love the idea of more formalized meetings between curatorial and development. I think that is just a wonderful thing, and Linda, you really put something in my head thinking about the very careful assignment of who the relationship manager is, and that can be anyone on the team. And I guess I would share my analogy that I use often in this work, is that of my sports analogy is volleyball, where you can move around the court and have a different role to play, and that you're supportive at one point and you're the spiker over the net in the other, and that if you are really playing on the team, that's when you're going to win the game.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think to the point of then how do you retain your relationship even though that institutional connection is important. I think you need, it's helpful to think of it's your personal relationship, personal/professional relationship, that is the bond to the institution. Because I know there's a lot of concern often about, well, I found this person, I've brought them along, now I'm supposed to hand them off and I'm not supposed to have any contact with them. That's not a successful fundraising strategy, either for individual projects or for the institution. So I think being big enough about the confidence of you're always going to have that kind of personal thread with someone. You have a certain kind of expertise that collector specifically is always likely going to want to have access to. So I think one of the tricks of the game is simply to not feel threatened. You know, you're part of the fabric that surrounds the relationship, and sometimes you're going to need to recede, sometimes you're going to need to be more prominent, and I think this is where sort of the cha-cha, if you will, or the rhythm of what it is that an institution is trying to accomplish is really the key takeaway message from this whole thing, in terms of understanding that you have an integral role and that you understand the role and the goals of the institution. It's that marriage that keeps all of that going.
Well, it seems that we might want to wrap up with one very last comment, and it is finally just to sort of reiterate some of the general rules that we can draw from this discussion about how to approach fundraising within the museum and with external sources.
It's not necessarily something that we've actually said over the course of this conversation, but I would say approach it with gusto. It's not something to be afraid of. I mean, if we keep in mind that we are all lifelong learners, then theoretically we should, as individuals, be able to learn how to do many things over time. And I would include in this the whole concept of being a partner in fundraising as well as being a fundraiser yourself. So, the gusto and the confidence and actually thinking that it's a fun challenge is something that I would suggest that people keep top of mind.
And I guess I would say, just reiterating again, that it's a team sport, and one that you can really have the most fun with if you really are playing along, and that there are learned behaviors, that listening is probably as much as important as making the case. And that sometimes is hard for us who've gone through the art history training to understand that sometimes it's not about what we say, it's what we hear, and that can be really a fun part of the whole process.
Well, I just want to say thank you to both of you, both Linda and Joy, and of course to William as well, for participating today, and thank you to all of our audience members, our attendees, who provide us with some great additional questions to the discussion. This webinar, I believe, will eventually go up online and sort of have an afterlife, as it were, but we're grateful to you both for your time and your expertise, and thanks everyone for participating.
Well, yes. Thank you. Fun.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you all.
Yes,
Bye.
thank you.